So without further ado, I'd love to introduce today's speakers. So Kristen is a research assistant professor here at the University of Vermont in civil and environmental engineering. She has more than 3 decades of academic and professional experience in water resources, bringing fields of aquatic ecology, fluvial geomorphology, hydrology, and environmental engineering together. Kristen's current research involves the application of advanced computational tools to better understand spatial and temporal variability in sediment and nutrient flux to inform sustainable design of built and natural infrastructure for geomorphic and ecological compatibility, and to direct river corridor conservation and restoration activities for reduced flood losses. Joining Kristen today is Lindsay Worley, who received her bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Vermont in 2013 and is currently a 4th-year civil and environmental engineering PhD student at the University of Vermont. Lindsay is advised by Dr. Kristen Underwood and Dr. Donna Rizzo. Before starting graduate school, she worked for a solar energy company and for a stormwater management firm. Thank you so much, Kristen and Lindsay, for being with us today to give us an update on your research and share some of your findings. We are so grateful to have you here. And as a Vermonter, I know how important this work is to the state and our local communities. So thanks so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley and Caroline. Appreciate all the hard work that went into organizing things for today. I'll share my screen. And hopefully y'all can. Everyone can see that, hopefully?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to acknowledge my co-investigators on this research, Donna Rizzo, Beverly Wemple, and Mike Klein, who all should be in the audience today. As Ashley mentioned, I'll be presenting with Lindsay Worley, my PhD student today, and we're also building off some past work of master's student Doug Deneau from computer science. In addition to the Sea Grant funding that we've received for this research, we're leveraging quite a few other funding sources. The last time we reported on this project, as Ashley mentioned, was just about a year ago in March, about a week after everything shut down. At the time, I provided a broad overview and a motivation for our research. Today, I thought we would focus a bit more on one aspect of our work, which is sediment regime classes, or how we're classifying our river reaches into these sediment regime classes, and how this classification scheme can inform priorities around the basin for restoration and conservation work. Our research and the mapping products from it are being used as a data layer in Vermont's Functioning Floodplain Initiative. So I'll touch briefly on what that is and provide some links, and talk a little bit about how our data is being used in that initiative. And then Lindsay will round out the presentation to finish by introducing her work, which is just getting underway, to develop an optimization tool that will aid stakeholders in prioritizing river reaches for floodplain reconnection or for conservation. The material that I'll present today comes from our paper that was recently published in the journal Geomorphology. It builds upon a classification system, though, that was set in place by Mike Klein back in 2010, proposed in the River Corridor Planning Guide that informs stakeholders, watershed groups, and others how to prioritize projects for river corridor protection and restoration. Rivers are very complex systems that exhibit lots of variability. And we can classify these rivers at a reach scale. And many of you in the audience, in fact, have been involved in some of the past stream geomorphic assessment work that has done just that, really, to split up a river network into lengths that have consistently characteristic form or patterns. And what we're finding with our research is that these forms are linked to process. processes that are responsible for generating the form. We find that river reaches differ in their tendency to produce sediment or transport sediment or deposit sediment. Some reaches are more transport dominated, some are more erosion prone, and others are key areas for deposition that we may want to capitalize on or leverage. We can define these tendencies as sediment regimes, or some folks like to talk about them as sediment process domains. So on one end of the spectrum, we might have very transport dominated reaches that are usually found in the headwaters of basins, though not exclusively, because they're in narrowly confined valley walls and have fairly steep pitch. They tend to have high stream power. Their channel boundaries, though, are defined by materials that are very erosion resistant, like bedrock or boulders. And so they tend not to be a significant source of sediment for that reason, but rather they're a pass-through. They're transporters of sediment that are supplied to them from upstream reaches. So you might think of the bedrock gorge above Moortown Village, for example, on the Mad River. Other types of transport-dominated reaches might include boulder step pool reaches that are also narrowly confined by their valley walls, but may have an occasional discontinuous flood bench along the sides of the channel. So you might think of, for example, the Middlebury Gap along Route 125 above East Middlebury, or down in the Battenkill River, the Roaring Branch along Kelly Stand Road in Sunderland. On the other end of the spectrum, we have reaches that are what we call coarse equilibrium fine deposition. And these are reaches that are in wide, unconfined valleys. They tend to have low gradient. Their channel boundaries are much less resistant to erosion. They're composed of things like gravels and sands and silts and even clays. But because of the low stream power afforded by the low gradient, they tend not to be a significant source of sediment to downstream reaches, usually. The coarser grained sediments are in equilibrium, meaning that whatever volume of those coarse fraction of sediments are supplied at the upstream end of the reach is probably similar to the volume that's leaving the reach. But importantly, because these green reaches, as we call them, are vertically stable and have good access to their adjacent floodplain, there's an opportunity for fine sediments carried in suspension by the river, like silts, clays, fine sands, to be deposited out into the floodplain. So when we have a well-connected, a reach that's well-connected to its floodplain, we have the opportunity for floodwaters to spill out into the adjacent floodplains. And these floodplains then perform many functions, allowing the sediment and nutrients to be filtered by the vegetation and settle out of the water column, replenishing nutrients to the soils, recharging the underlying groundwater beneath these systems, and supporting riparian habitats. So functioning floodplains also reduce flooding impacts to downstream communities by storing these floodwaters for later, much more gradual release. The town of Middlebury, for example, was able to avoid damages during Tropical Storm Irene as a result of wetland storage of floodwaters and upstream reaches along the Otter Creek. Many of you who've worked with the stream geomorphic assessment data or actually carried out assessments yourselves will be familiar with the classification system of Montgomery and Buffington, who described the sediment transport ability of mountainous rivers on a continuum from supply limited on the left of your view to transport limited on the right-hand side of your view. Our sediment regime classes are consistent with this Montgomery and Buffington classification. But importantly, they expand upon it to include or consider the vertical disconnection that occurs when reaches become disconnected from the floodplain as a result of channel incision. So these are the 6 classes of sediment regime that were originally proposed by Mike Klein in the River Corridor Planning Guidance as a way to think about rivers and their tendency to either source or transport or deposit sediments, and use that process information to help in the prioritization of restoration and conservation projects across the basin. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just these couple of unconfined, lower gradient, orange and red reaches, as we call them, that are incised below the floodplain and have lost some connection or become essentially vertically and laterally disconnected from that floodplain. Rivers can become incised in response to either natural causes or human causes. And let's focus on some human causes that have disconnected rivers, both vertically and laterally, from their floodplains. Historically, we've made land use choices that encroach upon our rivers and floodplains, including railroads and roads that may cut off meanders and essentially isolate large areas of the natural floodplain. We also know that many of our village settlements fill the floodplain around the state. The presence of this riverside infrastructure then leads us to manage rivers through channelization and dredging and berming and armoring in order to protect those riverside investments. And when channels become incised and lose floodplain connection, more floodwaters are contained within the channel cross-section. The channel then experiences greater stream power, and this increase in stream power can actually influence the sediment regime of the reach, converting it from a deposition-dominated reach in the green to an erosion-dominated reach that now becomes a net source of sediment to downstream reaches. We can predict this shifting status in sediment regimes. Many of you will be familiar with the channel evolution model of Schum and others that predicts the changing channel cross-section in response to a disturbance like dredging. To protect investments along our straightened river reaches, we've historically used lots of riprap to armor the banks, and we may install berms along the top of the bank for extra protection. But this can lead to further channel incision or head cutting that walks its way upstream, causing banks to become even more oversteepened. When future floods happen, floodwaters are no longer able to access the floodplain, and instead that excess flood energy is contained within the channel, causing erosion and undercut banks. And this erosion widening then requires more attention to reinforce the armoring or the berms. And historically, we've spent quite a lot of time and money, in the millions of dollars, to lock our straightened channels in place, essentially forcing them to stay in an incised condition. And this kind of river management is really unsustainable over the long term, especially as pointed out in early years by folks like Mike Klein and Barry Cahoon. And especially as we anticipate greater frequency of flooding in a changing climate. So in recent years, river management has focused on moving our infrastructure away from the riverbank, allowing rivers the room they need to move and adjust and evolve. With time, a channel will widen and degrade to recover access to the floodplain or a new floodplain at a lower elevation. These red reaches are some of the more active reaches along our rivers. Think of the Mad River upstream of American Flatbread in Waitsfield as a good example. But these very highly adjusting river reaches are actually doing good work for us. They're building a new stable floodplain that will be in balance with the water and sediment loads provided. They're key attenuation areas for floodwaters and coarse sediment, and eventually will store lots of fine sediment and nutrients as they regain floodplain access. We can support this process with passive restoration approaches, such as a town could adopt river corridor bylaws, or landowners could secure a conservation easement from folks like Vermont River Conservancy or other land trusts that are engaged in this work. Or we can simply focus on planting trees in these areas. And in red reaches in particular, we want to focus our tree planting out in the floodplain or at the very edges of the river corridor, because those rivers are adjusting so dynamically in the short term. We can also, though, pursue active restoration projects that accelerate that channel's return to a more stable state. Here's an example from the La Platte River in Heinsberg. The town garage had been perched along the riverbank on Beecher Hill Brook, a tributary to the river. And berms had been installed. You can see that person walking along the top of the berm. These had been installed over the years to protect the infrastructure from repeated flooding. But with funding from the Agency of Natural Resources and other sources, the town garage buildings were moved away from the river in 2018. The berm was actually removed and the natural floodplain was restored. And also the channel itself was raised using log and stone structures in order to reconnect it more effectively to the adjacent floodplain. Essentially, this work transformed the channel from a transport-dominated source of sediment, one of those orange reaches, to a net depositional condition when floodwaters can now access the floodplain and the sediment can be deposited, so a red reach or deposition-dominated red reach. So these kinds of projects can be costly, but they have very surprisingly high benefit cost ratios, especially when we consider all the many services provided to society by a functioning floodplain. So our work to classify the sediment regimes of rivers and the use of this information to prioritize restoration and conservation projects is being considered under the Vermont's Functioning Floodplain Initiative. So both active and passive restoration or floodplain reconnection projects are being considered under the FFI. And this project is developing a framework to better quantify the extent to which we have disconnected our rivers from their floodplains, and to identify and rank locations for strategic reconnection. So I invite you to go to this link at the bottom to learn more about the FFI, and I believe Ashley or Carolina is going to put a link, put that link in the chat for folks to connect to. Our work to define these sediment regime classes is now being used, as I mentioned, as an input to the FFI web mapping and the decision support system that will be accessed through that web tool in order to prioritize restoration and conservation projects. With help from a past student that I mentioned, Doug Deneau, who now works for the Natural Capital Project, PhD student Lindsay Worley is working to automate this classification of reaches for the Winooski River Basin, and eventually we'll expand that to the greater Lake Champlain Basin. Knowing where to implement these kinds of reconnection projects can be really challenging, especially under budgetary constraints. We'd like to be able to know what are the highest priority sites to achieve the greatest impact for the least amount of money. And there are many stakeholders and clean water service providers that are involved in this work, and there are a myriad of possible projects. So these factors have motivated Lindsay to think about developing a tool that could help a given stakeholder to optimize a suite of projects around the basin that will best accomplish the functional lift that we hope to gain by reconnecting our rivers. And so at this point, I'm just going to stop sharing and turn it over to Lindsay to share her slides. Or actually, I'm running the slides. So at this point, I'll continue, and Lindsay will unmute and I will mute.
Okay. And then do the next slide.
Sorry, for some reason, there we go. Now it's
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay. So when choosing a floodplain reconnection location, planners have many concerns. Often the budget is a major concern, as well as land availability. Right now, projects are either chosen because of willing landowners or other reasons, not necessarily because the location or technique will give the optimal result. There are also a lot of reaches to choose from. For example, if there were 50 reaches in a watershed and we were to compare all the different reach combinations for the watershed, there would be millions of combinations, too many for us to consider by hand. Additionally, there are also multiple stakeholders that have differing concerns on how the land will be used or modified. Different stakeholders use the land for different purposes, such as for agriculture or recreation, and also have different goals for reconnection projects, such as conservation or restoration. In order to help make the process more efficient for planners and address stakeholder concerns, a multi-objective optimization tool can be used. By using this optimization tool, the computer can do thousands and thousands of comparisons quickly and efficiently. In future meetings with stakeholders, we can help planners choose the best location for their project needs from these solutions. For this research, an optimization on a watershed scale is being created in order to identify high priority reaches for reconnection, which will allow planners to review a suite of possible options. The Winooski watershed will be analyzed with the proposed tool. The optimization tool can benefit the floodplain reconnection planning process by identifying a suite of solutions that consider multiple stakeholder goals. Multiple stakeholder concerns can be considered in the objective function, and a suite of high priority reaches can be identified for planners to choose from. An example is the figure on the right, where the authors compared sediment load, ecological health, and socioeconomic impact. Some might call socioeconomic impact an opportunity cost. Each of the dots on that plot is a solution that was calculated by the computer. The red circle below A shows the area where solutions would have good ecological health, low sediment load, but would have high socioeconomic impact. A solution in the blue circle around C would have high sediment load and bad ecological health, but low socioeconomic impact. So for our project in the Winooski Basin, stakeholders may have somewhat different objectives. Therefore, when the results are gathered, the axis might be phosphorus storage, inundation depth, and socioeconomic impact, or some may know it opportunity cost. Notice the change of axes labels on the plot in blue. And something I want to point out and make clear is that each of the dots is a solution that was calculated by the optimization tool. These solutions can be a suite of reaches that could represent a possible reconnection scenario project. For example, the one solution that is in the blue circle on the plot on the right could represent the 3 reaches circled on the figure on the left. So for this research, we are using a multi-objective optimization algorithm to maximize inundation in order to increase phosphorus storage while minimizing the socioeconomic impact. We are looking for the solutions that give the best trade-offs with a number of competing objectives. So the green circle by B would give moderate results for phosphorus storage, inundation, and socioeconomic impact. It is also important to note that the 3 axes shown here are just 3 factors that would be considered. As will be discussed in the next few slides, multiple inputs will be considered, but for the purpose of discussion, usually only 2 or 3 dimensions are compared on each of the results plots. So the objective function inputs of a multi-objective algorithm include factors that will help calculate an overall cost of each project. Numerous factors will be included in our objective function. The sediment regime types that Dr. Underwood described earlier will be one of the inputs in order to identify reaches that are high priority for reconnection. Depending on the stakeholders' goals, green reaches could be prioritized for conservation, while orange and red reaches could be prioritized for reconnection. Another input we are going to consider is the distance upstream of town centers. This would determine the distance of reaches from a town. Our hypothesis is that if we have 2 equivalent reaches, and one is, for example, 50 miles upstream of a town center, while another is 2 miles upstream of a town center, the reach closer to the town center, the 2-mile reach, would help reduce flooding damage in the town center more. The reach upstream, closer to the town center, would therefore be considered higher priority for reconnection if the project could protect the town's infrastructure by reducing the stream energies and velocities. Additionally, factors such as the project size, reach slope, land cover, incision ratio, and project costs will be considered as objective function inputs. This tool is created in a coding language called Python. In order to determine the suite of options for planners to choose from, we first calculate the objective function inputs just discussed. This data comes from sources such as the Vermont Geodata Portal website and the Vermont Stream Geomorphic Assessment website. These values are then used in an optimization code to produce a cost function, so each of the projects can be compared, considering all of the input parameters. Thousands and thousands of runs can be performed with the code, choosing reach location combinations, and the suite of options can be compared by the planners. In future meetings with stakeholders, we will help planners to evaluate the options and costs to choose the best scenario for their stakeholder needs. Just a few, yep. Thank you. And questions?
Yeah, we'll be glad to take anyone's questions.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen and Lindsay. It's so interesting to think about the intersection of resilience of our communities here in the Lake Champlain Basin when it comes to things like fluvial erosion, and to think about what's coming our way with a changing climate. And so this topic couldn't be more relevant, I think, to watershed planners here in the state.